I will be first introducing Dr. Cox, and he's talking about an enemy closer to us than any European power, the influence of the Mexican Revolution on popular opinion before World War I. This sounds very fascinating to me. Dr. Cox lives in Wimberley and is an award-winning historian, author, and conservationist who concentrates on 20th century political history and America media history. A sixth-generation Texan, he is president of Patrick Cox Consultants, a historical consulting firm. He has published 5 books, Dr. Cox? He is a BA and PhD graduate from the University of Texas at Austin. He went to Texas State for his MA. Woohoo! Is a distinguished alum of Texas State, a distinguished alum of the Texas State College of Liberal Arts, the American Journalism Historians Association President's Award. Cool. That was a good book. I really enjoyed that. And the 2017 Kenneth E. Hendrickson Award from the Texas Oral History Association. He will be speaking about how coverage by Texas newspapers of events associated with the Mexican Revolution eventually influenced Texans' opinions on World War I in Europe. Please help me in welcoming Professor Cox.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks everybody for coming in after lunch. I know that's sometimes challenging, so we'll try to keep everybody entertained as well as informed on this. And of course, I'm actually the warm-up act. Allison will be do the real presentation, because as you'll see, everything I'm going to do today, after we get past this slide, everything's going to be black and white. Okay. So she'll have the more colorful presentation today. Hey, Mark, one thing I do want to say, and I want to thank the General Land Office for doing, one thing we did not put in our presentation here is prior to my career as an historian, getting my doctorate in history, I was an assistant land commissioner at the General Land Office back in the 80s. And as I explained to some of my friends earlier, probably don't have to do it with this room, but when I said the 80s, that's the 1980s, okay? Because the land office has been around, it's the oldest agency in the state dating back to the Republic. Okay, enough about me. Let's talk about the events primarily in Texas and what's happening to influence Texans' opinions about World War I. I started on this as a research project because, as we said in the introduction, I do media history as well, and I'm very interested as far as a lot of the writings and studies that I work on the influence of the media in our culture and politics and public opinion and policy. We started, don't want to lose this. Before I get into the slides, let me do a short premise on my thesis of how we entered into this project and what evolved in it. And it started out, I wanted to look at public opinions and the influence that the newspapers were providing in Texas in this era of the early 20th century. A couple things, first of all, newspapers were the medium of communication during this era. A lot of people have called this the golden age of journalism, the golden age of newspapers. There were, by this time, very large daily newspapers in Texas, and for these purposes, I primarily looked at Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, and El Paso, and looking at the pre-war coverage. The second thing about this, the combined coverage of all the major daily papers at this time was around 4 million people. That is more than the entire population of Texas at this time. So one of the critiques, and one of the things I had to answer in looking at the influence of these newspapers, is that not only are they being read by people within the cities in which they reside, these are also being distributed quite widely around the state in rural communities and smaller communities. And newspapers are the medium of, as I'm determining this, are the medium of influence. In looking at, and as I hope I'll talk about in this presentation today, when war breaks out in Europe in 1914, the vast majority of Texans, one, are quite glad that we have the isolationist sentiment as well as the geographic distance between World War I. There is also a very significant, and I think many of you know this too, there's a very significant German influence in Texas, particularly in San Antonio and some of the other areas, and in Central Texas, both from the business and commercial side as well as significant parts of the population as well. In contrast, the Mexican Revolution, which started prior to the official beginning of World War I, Mexican Revolution that begins in 1910, what I came to discover in doing the research on this is that the Mexican Revolution had extensive coverage of events by newspapers throughout Texas. It was strongest, of course, in San Antonio and El Paso, but it was also considerable in the other major metropolitan dailies of this time, too. The other important aspect as far as the research of this, there are significant, as we all know, there are significant Hispanic communities, Latino communities throughout Texas, but particularly in South Texas and West Texas at this time. There are Spanish language papers which I looked at as well. So, but for the purpose of this today, what I'm just going to do is narrow this down to a couple of topics, what I consider some of the most influential events to cover, and then also really focus on some of the presentation and the coverage by the major daily newspapers. As the Houston Post declared, and this is moving forward a little bit, in April 7th, 1917, we may find an enemy closer to us than any European power. The enemy to which the Post was referring to was Mexico. So let me go ahead and begin and move to a couple of I'm going to take it for granted that this is an educated audience and you know to some degree about the events and the unfolding of the Mexican Revolution. It officially begins in 1910. The Diaz government, basically Porfirio Diaz, abdicates, and then there's a succession of leaders and then military leaders that have come in, some of whom that I will mention in this. So that's the preface. And of course, part of, from the cultural aspect as well as the historical aspect, some of the most enduring characters, enduring images that we have in the Mexican Revolution come from the quote-unquote the revolutionaries, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, Pascual Orozco, and other figures like that who become popularized to a large degree, and I believe because of not just their activities in the war, but they also become dominant figures and are pictured and discussed quite often, especially in the Texas newspapers. So let me start, and again, I'm just going to pick out some pivotal events here just to begin with, to look at. Let's see if I'm pointing this the right direction. If I go a different way, you'll know I pointed it the wrong way. Ah, it works. Okay. This is what is known as the Plan de San Diego from 1915. The Plan of San Diego, and I'll talk about this in a second, but it was first carried by the Texas Press newspapers. It was initially exposed by the San Antonio Express after what was a person who was labeled as a, quote, Mexican raider was captured in South Texas. According to the story, Jose Garcia told his American captors he had, quote, been forced to join a gang which he said proposed to liberate that portion of Texas between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. Okay, you know your geography. Essentially what we're talking about is the Nueces Strip, that area that was disputed for many, many decades in the 19th century between Mexico and the U.S. and Texas. From this initial story, dailies throughout the throughout the state began comparing this, discussing this story called the Plan de San Diego, because it originated, there's a very small town in South Texas called San Diego. Anybody been there besides me? Good, all right. I've told this to some people and they're saying, well, why are you talking about California? I said, no, the real San Diego, South Texas. The document, and this is the Spanish, this was one of the original plans that was printed and circulated, which the newspapers got a hold of. Among the things it says in there, it says there's a planned uprising against the United States that would, quote, free all of Mexico and Mexicans from Yankee tyranny. They called for the death of all American males not just in Texas, but all the border states, anyone over the age of 16. And they proclaimed that a new republic for, quote, Mexicans, Negroes, Japanese, and Chinese would be formed out of the states along this new international border. Now, this plan, although well publicized, never actually was implemented, but compared to the press coverage that it drew, it was like the plan. There were so many stories and so many editorials in all of the newspapers about this. And so let me give you a few examples of this. The San Antonio Express proclaimed there should be no halfway methods used to clear out the bandits now terrorizing the Rio Grande Valley. Bandits is one of the names that's been used for many years associating people who were either coming from Mexico or living in South Texas, who were described as outlaws or more often bandits who were part of the uprising. There should be no halfway methods used to clear out these bandits, now terrorizing the Rio Grande Valley. The lesson to be effective must be thorough. The Express also said that there were going to be terrible consequences to be paid if the, quote, ignorance and blinded fanatics of the Plan de San Diego were to come into effect. The congressman from that era in South Texas was a man who becomes much more famous later, John Nance Garner. Congressman Garner represents all of South Texas all the way up to San Antonio and then further out West Texas to West Texas. Congressman Garner, who becomes quoted quite often in these stories, he accuses not just the people with the Plan of San Diego, but accuses the government of Mexico as the party and the entity that would be responsible for the, quote, bandit outrages. So retaliation follows quite quickly. This is one of the photos, and this has been reproduced quite a bit in a number of books and histories that have been done on this particular era. This is the Texas Rangers were dispatched to South Texas by the governor, Governor Ferguson, along with the forces that were already there, and primarily groups of Anglo landowners and residents of South Texas who banded together to not just fight people who were coming up from across the river, the quote-unquote bandits, but the warfare, essentially what happened it was extended against native Hispanic settlers and residents of South Texas, both in towns and cities, as well as among the ranchos in South Texas. I've been talking about San Antonio. Here's an example. Dallas, you think, is a much more enlightened community. That's what they always tell us. Who's here from Dallas? And I've already offended. Okay. Okay. This is from the Dallas Morning News. The ignorance and the embedded prejudice of the peon against Americans makes it the kind of tinder that is easily lighted. They go on to explain the justification for sending, people and sending the Rangers into South Texas. Both as laborers and voters, interesting, they are not highly efficient, perhaps, but they are cheap and even profitable. Crushing the raiders and eliminating all the offenders was part of what was necessary to do, according to the Dallas Morning News, in reaction to the plan to San Diego, because Mexico and the supporters were, quote, still capable of inciting Mexicans on both sides of the Rio Grande to acts of violence against the people of this country. As the Rangers come in, and I'll talk about this photo in a second, but they became quoted quite frequently in the newspapers throughout the state. One Ranger captain, his name is J.M. Fox, told the San Antonio Express in part of one of the stories, it says, quote, "We got another Mexican, but he's dead." Another report came in from Brownsville, from some of the pursuers in that area, saying they were after 2 Mexicans, but, quote, "they tried to escape. We could not identify them, so we just left them there." And they left them there after they had been killed, as was confirmed in the newspaper. This particular photo was widely distributed in the major dailies, and it depicts a group of Texas Rangers, ropes from the Rangers' horses, as you can see, and it's a little bit distorted down here on the bottom, but there were a number of dead, again, quote, identified as bandits who were bound and lifeless. The San Antonio Express reported in September 1915 that, quote, "finding of dead bodies of Mexicans suspected for various reasons of being connected with the Troubles has reached a point where it creates little or no interest." There was no actual accounting of the number of people who were actually killed. There have been a number of historians, beginning with Walter Prescott Webb, and who have looked at it over the years, who have tried to determine this. But it ranges from the thousands up to 5,000 to 10,000. There's no way to actually tell how many people were actually killed. There was a major displacement, though, of Hispanic residents of South Texas and to some degree in West Texas, and a larger influx, as you would imagine, into the cities in Texas, both San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, and others throughout the Southwest. Let me move to the next one. Again, this is from the San Antonio Express in 1915. And I particularly like this one because there's a lot going on in this particular issue. Texas realized, and I heard this in one of the earlier sessions today about the Texas Guard Unit. Remember, it said when they were going to enter World War I, we'd already been down here practicing and working and training to take care of Mexico, and we could take care of Mexico all by ourselves. So this is, what truly happened down here is not only are people and posses and the Rangers being mobilized, but the state and the congressional leaders are also asking President Wilson to send more troops in. So in particular, what you can see on this, and I thought what was very illustrative behind this, is that it's not just a groundswell or just a revolutionary movement that's originating just from San Diego and people that are living in the area. But there's now finger pointing and stories coming out that the government of Mexico is now responsible for encouraging, supplying, training, and providing support for those, the raiders who are coming in from into South Texas and actually on both sides of the border. And I think the other thing that's important to remember at this time is throughout this period in Mexico, there are factions, pro-government, anti-government, there are factions supporting Villa, there are factions supporting other leaders in Mexico. And again, sorry I can't get into all that, but there's a lot of turmoil going out, throughout this entire region at the same time. But this was one of the first examples, and this becomes a pretty dominant theme for the next few years. We'll talk for a minute or two about Pancho Villa. Villa was, I think, a lot of things have been said about him, and there's been a lot of good history and biographies on him. But Villa was exceptional as a strategist for his ability to be able to court the American press and receive very positive, up until the Columbus, New Mexico raid, but receives very prominent and very, for the most part, very positive coverage in the newspapers. He centered most of activities in Chihuahua, in that part of northern Mexico. He frequented El Paso quite often, both for, it was a safe harbor, but it was also a good recruiting area. He raised money there as well. And I've even found a story where he was mentioned in the El Paso newspaper for giving $1,000 to El Paso charity groups who were assisting women and children. So Pancho Villa, the philanthropist. Y'all probably haven't heard that. He frequently met with local officials, including a well-publicized, again in the El Paso paper, with El Paso Mayor C.E. Kelly on the International Bridge in November 13. It was at this meeting, and then after this, he also was quoted as saying that he would not, quote, he would not be dragged into a war with the U.S. by anybody. Of course, things changed with the raid in March 1916, and the subsequent attention that it drew from the United States and the Wilson administration, and of course, putting John Pershing and 10,000 troops in, quote, hot pursuit of the Villistas, and it received quite a significant amount of coverage in the American press, but in particular the Texas press, while this was occurring. As you know, Pershing spent most of 1916 involved in the elusive and, as it turned out to be, unproductive chase of Pancho Villa in northern Mexico. Although, again, historians, and I think we've heard from some other presentations, it was a successful training exercise as far as a foreign operation by the U.S. Army, although unsuccessful in its real goal. So up until this time, so this takes us into 1916, by far looking at the major Texas newspapers that I mentioned and these types of stories that have continued over the years, there's much more attention paid to the Mexican Revolution as opposed to the war in Europe. Second is, while you see some divided opinions, both editorially and news coverage, people aren't really favoring the German government, but the German government, before the U.S. enters the war, is very active through their consulates, through the embassy, and they are trying to provide their side of the information. Some of that does make it into the press here as well. But from this point, up until this point, the Mexican Revolution and the coverage, the inflammatory language, both from the news reporting side as well as the editorial side, really does become the dominant issue in Texas newspapers. So let me cover the last real major issue just for a minute, and then we'll get to the conclusion. And then I think we're going to go to Allison first before questions, right? Okay. I just want to get through mine and make sure you get your 2.5 hour allotment to cover. Like I said, I'm an opening act. With the discovery of and the publicity of the Zimmerman note that came in 1917, it was interpreted by most newspapers, both in coverage and editorials. This was really a self-fulfilling prophecy for several reasons. One is, many had suspected that Germany, because of actions that had gone on before, were aiding the government in Mexico. There was collusion also going back to the plan of San Diego and other incidents where there had been stories, and many of which had been reported by the press, that the German government was active in aiding Mexico and trying to keep the United States out of the war. When the Zimmerman note, as it became known, was distributed, and of course that came from British intelligence. I likened it to coming. It was essentially a political hurricane that hit the state. Indignation was displayed prominently on every front page, not just from the time of the publication of the Zimmerman note, but for weeks and weeks and weeks. There was one I thought very interesting. They were showing and starting to depict German soldiers and other German officials pictured as devils. There was one political cartoon that had, this devil figure handing over cash money and I think it's some other arms to, a person in a sombrero. The editors began, which they had not done until this happened. They started linking this plan, the Zimmerman plan, and other, as they started describing them, German atrocities as, quote, an act of hostility, a true casus belli. The Houston Post denounced Germany after this, and this was typical of the editorials that were coming out. They said Zimmerman, they were not only aiding and abetting Mexico in this undertaking, they were, quote, utterly ignorant of conditions in Mexico. So the reality was, shortly after this, and then this is really before the U.S. officially enters the war, that the Dallas Morning News and many other newspapers have declared, and this is after Zimmerman, but before the entry, this country in reality is at war now. They began calling for more military buildups. They're already supporting escalation and intervention. And again, this is in direct contrast to positions that these same newspapers and public opinion had held 2 to 3 years prior to this. Mexico was our first mistake, the news said, And they said because the United States had been, quote, overly tolerant toward Mexico, there was no such reason to now show that type of restraint towards Germany. We should have taken action at the beginning of troubles, the news declared, and they concluded that it was, they and other papers, that it was time for the United States and, of course, Texas to build on the experience that they had gained during the revolutionary era in Mexico and during that revolution, and to put that into effect for American troops and American readiness for entering World War I. So let me just, I'm going to conclude with that. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of how I introduced this. The Dallas Morning News, and this is after the official declaration of war in April 1917, President Wilson and the congressional leadership were all very supportive of this. There were one or two notable exceptions, and they did not survive the next year's primary election. The war, and as the war began and the preparations began for the United States to intervene in Europe, the papers in Texas still said and still cautioned that we needed to keep an eye on Mexico. They were concerned that, and Texas editors urged people to, quote, keep a sharp eye on the Rio Grande. They said that Germany, quote, has made war on us at home with torch and bomb. And they hearkened it back to the Plan of San Diego via the Zimmerman telegram and others. The Houston Post concluded, we may find an enemy closer to us than any European power. War upon the fields of Texas is not beyond the powers of the imagination, and home guards may be needed. So I think the result from all of this, and looking at these newspapers that went on, and I'm sorry, I should have advanced this up a couple of it. Yeah, I forgot. There's the Houston Post story with the revelation. I love it's kind of fun reading newspapers from this era, because even people, if you need your glasses, I don't need my glasses to read the headlines, you know. It's really good. And I love reading all the old newspapers, but some of you may remember San Antonio in particular has always had a reputation for, what's the polite word, sensational, inflammatory news. And you know, there used to be two papers, some of you may remember this, there used to be two papers in San Antonio, right? The Light and the Express News, right. And this is back in my old newspaper days, their nicknames were the San Antonio Blight and the San Antonio Excuse News. But not to be outdone, my friends from Dallas, and you probably heard this, we called it the Dallas Morning Snooze. That's another story. Okay, I got to stop because I've done my 30 minutes. But again, I think what I would like for you to take away from this, and I think what this shows is that the newspapers in Texas were major leaders of building public and influencing public positions and helping determine public policy, that the people, but also importantly, the political and business leadership, and this is again in the Anglo community in Texas, were following the press and the media very closely, and there's a very close connection between the two. When the war broke out in Europe in 1914, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether the U.S. should begin and be concerned about participating. There was still concern about military preparedness and buildup. When it came to Mexico and the border, It was a totally different situation. And people, the press in particular, was very reactionary in that sense. They used what clearly to us today is derogatory and racist terminology in how they depicted people, and they victimized through their coverage and influence opinions. A lot of people suffered and a lot of people were victimized as a result of this action. But in doing all this, with this buildup and with this bellicose attitude that everybody had towards Mexico, once Germany got connected, it becomes a real easy pattern from that point to help change public opinion to enter and have the United States enter into World War I on behalf of the Allies. Let me show y'all. I found this doing some research a couple of weeks ago. This is from the University of Texas. Any of y'all went to UT. They used to do, and you see the date, April 1. They used to do an April Fool's edition every year. And for some reason, I just said, I want to see what they did when the U.S. declared war. So here you go. A lot of people would still agree with this, probably think it's serious. The UT campus is a hotbed of German intrigue. They're in the hands of the Teutons. Anyway, it was all a spoof.
All right, with the beginning in 1910, we have an increased military focus on the Rio Grande border area, and the excuse for this is bandits, but in fact, I'm curious, was there actually a documented in any way increase in criminal activity down there, or was this just the normal kind of rough and tumble, occasional rustling or whatever else that was going on?
There was ongoing activity going on in South Texas and West Texas on both sides of the border. What exacerbated it, though, was the revolution itself, because it turned, especially the borderlands area, it became a war zone because people were fleeing to come to this side of the Rio Grande not just Villa, but many others were coming over to the United States to not just raise money, but to get guns to take back across the border as well. And
People in Texas selling guns in Mexico?
shocking, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. So, and again, I kind of just did the highlights of all this. But yeah, but there's an escalation of violence that really, it starts somewhat after 1910, but it really escalates after the Plan de San Diego and from 1914 on. And coincidentally, while the revolution in Mexico is going on simultaneously, it's becoming, much more dangerous, much more bloody, and the country's very divided as well. Good question.
Anybody else? One more.
We're on time, right?
Straddling the war is the U.S. occupation of Veracruz that starts in April and runs through November 1914. How was that? Was that an issue in the Texas press?
I didn't hear all that.
Could you repeat it?
I didn't hear the first part, I'm sorry.
Starting in April 1914 and running through November is the U.S. occupation of Veracruz.
Oh, Veracruz, okay.
Yeah. Probably less controversial than people coming into the United States, but it was probably more of a foreign policy aspect. How is that shown in the Texas press?
Yeah, the question was, and again, that was another example I didn't cover, when the United States Navy entered the port of Veracruz for collection of unpaid duties and some other debts and things like that. Yeah, that was viewed very favorably by the Texas press. The press at this time, one of the roles that they are assuming that I didn't go into, but the press leaders and the publishers are all very commercial minded. They're really trying to build stronger financial centers and commercial enterprises for their respective cities and for the state as a whole. So they're visionaries in that regard, but they're also because of that, they're very critical of anything that they say would help create instability, that would question the status quo, that would threaten at least local governmental structures and things of that regard. They don't see that the United States government, because you all remember, this is 100 years ago, the U.S. government does not have a major role, domestically, but they do see their primary role, besides delivering the mail, is the military, and that the military should be prepared and should be ready, although they're what they say and then what happens in Washington, of course, are two different things. Doesn't sound like today, but So I hope that answers. Okay.
We're going to have to cut it off. Thank you, Dr.
Good.
Cox.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark.